I'd like to call to order the City of Oak Harbor Planning Commission special meeting. This being November 9, 2016, 7 p.m. Let the record show that all the commissioners are present except for Cecil Pierce and Jess Walker-Weiss. My understanding is that Jess will join us somewhere soon in the meeting process here. The second item on the agenda tonight is the continuation of the public hearing that was opened on 10/25/2016. We plan to continue a public hearing to consider code amendments to the incorporate low impact development as required when feasible methods for treating and infiltrating stormwater. At this time, I'd like to call on the public. Noticing that no one's here, I think we will go with staff and Dennis. Would you like to give us a little more insight here, please?
I will. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good evening, Planning Commissioners. Staff's presentation tonight will be basically in three components. The first will be to discuss the new information that's before you tonight, and that's the three attachments as part of your packet. The second piece will be a little bit more discussion on what we're planning to do with parking in subdivisions of 10 lots or greater, some of the flexibility that we're trying to create in this code. And then the third piece will be a graphic representation of some of the discussion that we had at the October 25th meeting regarding where in a developed lot, where will this be implemented, the stormwater regulations as far as low impact development be created. So we've got some pictures that we can talk to about that. So with that, I'd like to address the three attachments that are in your packet this evening. The first is the promised spreadsheet, which is not a required document, but staff thought it would be a good idea to put together this spreadsheet that's consistent with the Department of Ecology's toolkit, which we've been discussing all along here, and addresses the general topics, the subtopics, and the considerations that the Department of Ecology identified as items that we need to at least address. So this spreadsheet was prepared to show each one of those specific items, whether we saw that as a gap in our existing code, and if we did, how did we really address it? Did we amend our code? Did we find that there's a conflict with some other regulation that we had? And if we did amend our code, we created a brief statement as to what we did and where we put it. So that's that attachment one document. Attachment two is just basically a list of the fine-tuning and some of the additional items that staff has created since we distributed the book back at our joint meeting with the City Council on October 19th. Those list, I believe there's 10 items on that list. They've all been incorporated in the draft ordinance, which incidentally makes up attachment number 3. So the draft ordinance, which is pretty lengthy, encompasses all of the staff recommended amendments to our code to incorporate low impact development in conformance with our phase 2 permit requirements. The one thing of note, the section 39 in the ordinance, which is on page 40 of the ordinance, it's a definition for creek. Staff, as of today, engineering staff has recommended that we remove that section from the proposed ordinance because that definition that we have in the ordinance is from the manual, while in fact the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife has a different definition for creek. So in order to maintain some flexibility as we move down the track, whether it be with conformance with WDFW information or conformance with the manual, we're going to request that we remove that section of the ordinance. So with that, that's basically the three attachments that we've included. I will turn this over to Brad to go into a little bit more detail as to one of the sections that we are creating, and that's to create some flexibility for parking within subdivisions. So Brad?
Good evening. If you turn to page 72 of the ordinance, Dennis and I added a chapter that talks about parking. We had some questions, I think, at the previous Planning Commission meeting and at the joint council Planning Commission workshop about will there be enough parking in the neighborhoods. Through this process over the last year and a half or 2 years, we've talked about parking a lot. And prior to our code change in 2011, our city streets used to have 2 parallel parking lanes as a standard. In 2011, we changed the city street standards to allow for just 1 parallel parking lane. And then we also adjusted a flexible, or created a flexible process to change the street sections through administrative approval or a council action. So with the standard section being allowed to have just 1 parallel parking lane without going through the administrative approval or council action, we would generally achieve at least 1 public parking space in a neighborhood per single-family lot. So if you had 20 lots, we'd have at least 10. Generally, we'd have more than 50%. So what we did as staff, we talked about some of the questions that came up. We've been talking about this for a while. We changed the required public parking space requirement to 1 public parking space per lot. So if you had a 20-lot subdivision, you would need 20 parking places. Now, that's a requirement for what's called a long plat or a short plat. We did not apply this to a long plat or a standard plat. We did not apply this to short plats, which is 9 lots or less. So we said now on page 72, item E at the top of the page, it says, in subdivisions of 10 lots or more, 1 public parking space per single-family residential unit shall be provided. Now here's some flexibility, and that's what we learned everybody wanted from our public stakeholders meeting and just going through the process over the last several years. It says this ratio may be reduced to a minimum of 1 public parking space per 2 units if additional on-parcel parking is provided under the following condition. So right now, before we change our code, we only require 1 public parking space per 2 single-family homes. This paragraph is changing it to 1 public parking space per single-family residence. So instead of 10 public parking spaces for 20, we require 20 for 20, except under this condition. Basically, under administrative approval, we can allow them to go down to the 1 public parking space per 2 single-family lots. So if you had 20 lots, you could go down to 10 public parking spaces if they provide, if they take 10 lots and require 5 on-parcel parking spaces. So what I'm talking about is right here is a house in a local plat, and
I'm sorry, it'll be easier for the
oh, I'm
commission
sorry.
to see this one.
Sorry, thank you. Okay, so this house and this house are only a few hundred feet apart in the same plat in town. This has 4 parking spaces by our code. They're only required to have 2 right now, and that will stay. They'll only have to have 2 except under this condition. They have 2 in the garage, and they have 2 in front of it. Since there's required setbacks and you can't put a garage right up against the street, as soon as you have a 2-car garage, you have a 2-car apron front. So by default, most houses have 4 spaces. In this picture right here, this house has 3 spaces in front. So what we're trying to prevent is we don't want people to come in and add concrete on a weekend without going through the engineering process. If they do that, city staff will be tasked with going out and saying, hey, this doesn't meet the LID requirements. It's not pervious, or it doesn't drain to a rain garden. So what we've done is add flexibility for the developer in saying, you can provide your 20 public parking spaces for your 20 lots, or we can allow you to go down to, all the way down to 10 public parking spaces for 20 lots, but you must do this, where you have 5 spaces, 2 in the garage and 3 in the front, or up to 3 in the garage and 2 in the front. And this will go through the design process where this hard surface is either pervious or it drains to a rain garden in accordance with LID best management practices we're required to enforce. This will provide more parking in the neighborhood, and it will reduce the rate of the illicit driveway expansion on weekends, where people dump gravel, or they have a concrete contractor come in and pour a slab on a Saturday, and then staff drives by on Monday and says, wait a second, where's your permit, where's your engineering, why isn't that pervious, or why isn't it drained to a rain garden, rip it out. We don't want to be in that situation. So what we've done is, we believe this paragraph allows the applicant more flexibility to either get their parking through 2 parallel parking lanes, a single parallel parking lane, and parking courts, parking alleys, the other mechanisms that are already in our code for public parking, or have a mix of the minimum amount of public parking spaces and some larger on-parcel parking quantities. Questions on that? I went through it kind of quick and then,
Yeah.
okay.
Let's take the one that's got the 3-car garage.
Okay.
It's got 2 cars in the driveway. So you're saying that the third spot for the 3rd-car garage would not be paved?
Pardon?
The photograph on the left,
This one?
uh-huh. You're saying you would not require the developer to pave that if it's a 3-car garage?
No, they'd have the option to pave it. If it's a 3-car garage, it would make sense to pave it.
Right.
But they could have a 2-car garage and 3 stalls in front. That frequently happens. I have another picture here. Okay, so here's another one. These houses are right next to each other in town. This has 4 stalls, 1, 2, 3, 4. This has either 6 or 5. I'm not sure how many fit in that garage. I didn't drive by, but you can fit 3 cars here. So the way this paragraph works is if a developer came in, did a 20-lot plat, and they could get 15 through parallel parking lanes, they would have to do this on 5 of the 20 lots. We think it's reasonable. We've looked at this from every angle. We're trying to allow the developer to meet LID and not build roads that are unaffordable to maintain and that they can't meet their stormwater requirements with. The other thing is, if we look at a lot of neighborhoods, we see this. Drive through Fireside, drive through Fairway Point neighborhoods. This is getting more and more common. What we're trying to do is get it up front and get it engineered so they're compliant with the rules, and so they're not doing it later.
I'm still having a hard time with that.
With the
Well,
size, or
if
just
you had 10 or 20 lots and you're allowing parking on one side of the street, and I don't know about the rest of the commissioners, but I park my cars in my garage, but most of my neighbors don't.
right?
And I've lived in a facility before where they started it, and then the teenagers started driving, and all of a sudden there's no longer 3 cars, there's 6 cars.
That's
Where do
exactly
they park?
That's exactly why we did this, because right now, the current code only requires for a 20-lot plat, 10 public parking spaces. So this will increase the amount of parking in the neighborhood, because they'll either meet the 20, or maybe they'll get 15 public parking spaces, and they'll have to do 5 houses like this. They won't be able to do every house, all 20 like that.
Will
It
they
could
then be required then to use their garages for parking?
No, we're not going that far.
Okay.
We tried to strike a balance where we improve. Everybody uses their garage differently. You're right, some people use it for storage of things other than their vehicles.
I'm just asking the question.
No, I appreciate it's a complex matter. It's difficult because people live differently, and some people have kids and some don't. They go through different phases of life in that same house. Maybe they have 3 kids, and then when the kids move out, there's only 2 of them. But when those kids are there and their friends are over, there might be 6 cars.
Yeah. Okay.
And what we're trying to do is get this designed and engineered so it's compliant with the rules and not just done on a weekend where we're forced into an enforcement action. It's not a perfect system, but we think it's better than what we have. And from looking at other communities and some of the parking problems that are happening all over the greater Seattle area, I think we're ahead on this than most communities with this approach. Somebody can still come in and build 2 parallel parking lanes, but most of them are going to choose not to because of the cost and the stormwater.
That's what I was just going to ask you. Do you think that most will develop towards a preference?
I think most will choose a single parking lane, and generally that's going to provide over 50% of the required public parking, but not 100%. On a 20-lot plat, depending on the street layout and how many corner lots, they'd probably have at least 10 public parking spaces with a single parallel parking lane in the road, but they would probably really have maybe 12 to 14, or let's say 10 to 14. So that would mean in that neighborhood, let's use 15 as the middle there, 5 houses have to be like this, where this would be pervious or draining to a rain garden per the DOE manual.
This is kind of off-topic question, but does it change the liability at all? Public parking versus a parking space in my driveway? If there was an incident, I mean, is there any liability for the city when it comes to public parking?
No, I think anything that happens on private property is going to be, depending on the causation,
And it's the same user that we're trying to get at, right? So whether you're parking your extra vehicles on the street, or you're parking your extra vehicle or your visitor is on your lot, it's the same user that we're looking at. So I don't think there's any additional exposure for us. It may actually even be just slightly reduced by
That's
getting
kinda what
by
I
getting
was-
those vehicles off the street. Although I wouldn't hang my hat on it.
Yeah, I was just thinking safety and liability and security. I mean, it seems more attractive to have it all happening in the driveway versus on the street.
well, we need some public parking in the
Right,
neighborhoods.
but I think this is a good compromise.
Yeah, it's
And a
going
good
to provide
option.
more parking than our current code requires if a developer chose to come and do this on every single house. When he's required to do this, there's going to be a little more space in that neighborhood, and I wouldn't doubt it if a lot of them start choosing to do this for many of the homes, because I think this is what a lot of customers really want. They may want a boat, maybe they have a teenager or two, maybe all their stuff's in the garage, they can't put their car in the garage. So it just gives more flexibility. And hopefully people who buy these houses are the people who need that extra parking. Obviously, if a person that's single and has one car buys that house, and the person with 8 cars buys this, it's not going to work, but we can't force that. Go ahead.
Is there an additional burden to a developer to go with the home on the left versus on-street parking when you look at stormwater retention and that sort of thing? Is
think
it more
this is-
advantageous to put the parking on the street versus on the lot if you're running out of space?
This is less pavement because when you make a parallel parking lane, there's a lot of wasted pavement in between legal parking places, in between driveways, near fire hydrants, at corners, that kind of thing. But when you do this, it's a much more efficient use of hardened space. So I would think it's cheaper. I also think that you probably get more for your house if there's enough parking in the neighborhood.
Are you seeing with typical lot sizes and the shift towards this, is there still enough room on the lot to do 1,500 to 2,000 square foot home, all this additional parking and the rain gardens? How does that all fit into the lot?
I believe there is. Ray's going to talk about some lot sizes here in a little bit. I think Ray is, or Dennis. Oh, Dennis is. Yeah, we're already seeing this on some of the narrow lots in the PRD, and it'll fit. What'll be different is this will probably be pervious. So in the planned residential developments, we already have narrower lots, and we see 3-car driveways.
And I think this concept is consistent with one of our basic principles as we've been trying to work on this project, which is for us not to be prescriptive in the solutions, but to provide choices, or you heard the word flexibility a lot. So if this idea works for a particular developer in a particular set of circumstances, great. If it works better for them to do the on-street parking like they are accustomed to doing, that's great as well. If their project is such that they can mix and match, that's great as well. So we were really just trying to give the choices, and because the one thing we were sure of is if we were prescriptive, there would be situations where it would not work.
Okay, so Ray just wanted me to point out that it doesn't require a 3-car garage. It's just requiring a total of 5 spaces. So this could be a 2-car garage and then the 3 in front. And I think what Steve said about the flexibility, it's conceivable a developer could come in with a plat and have some neighborhoods with parallel parking lanes, some blocks without, with maybe a parking court, such as in Cherry Hill. Woodby Greens has some little off-street parking courts. There's a parking court in a cul-de-sac in Fireside 4, I think, 3, 4, something like that. That I've parked in many times because we used to have friends that lived in there. They could do that and this. So the whole point is to provide enough parking through a combination of allowed uses that fits with the need and the topography of the land and how they want to go about doing their project and meeting these requirements. We're trying not to force everybody into one cookie cutter design, because it just probably isn't going to work these days with the new rules. And so much of this depends upon the types of soils that are out there about the LID design. And the soils vary.
Just to clarify, so we are, from our current code to this revision, this requires more parking be available. But
Yes.
it's in compliance with LID, looking at pervious surfaces and rain gardens and all of those other requirements.
Yes,
Thank you.
you're welcome.
Just want to make sure I'm following.
Yeah.
Yes, so this will be an increase in parking for plat over what the current code says.
Great. Great job.
Thank you.
Yes, you've mentioned a couple times about soil compatibility. Has there been any study done within the city limits and of what types of soils you expect to see and what impact that will have?
There have been a lot of studies turned into us over the years with projects that they have a geotechnical engineer go out and do a soils report, and they turn in to support their project. Maybe they need it to show that their foundations will work for their commercial building or for their stormwater design or their road design. So we have those reports from different neighborhoods and commercial properties, but we don't have a comprehensive map of all of Oak Harbor. We just have where there's been recent developments where we started requiring reports, I don't know, 20 years ago or something. But prior to that, there's not a lot of information.
You do have the general soils conservation map, though.
There is something that it's now the Natural Resources Conservation Service has what's called a soil survey, but it's just a starting point when you're engineering. You look at it and you find out what soil they identified there, but doesn't mean it's actually there, and it's more of a general sense of what's there. You still have to investigate it. It would be a pretty big task to map all of our soils and develop that map. Very expensive and probably quite a few years.
I was just curious if any had come to mind that may not be functional for this type of development.
Yeah, I think we have some areas in the city that are highly permeable, which means the LID will be required generally. And then there's some areas where the soil is not very permeable at all, which actually is some of the infeasibility criteria for many of the LID BMPs is if the soils are not permeable or high groundwater tables. So it's conceivable in certain areas of the city they won't have to do the rain gardens and the pervious pavements. And in those cases, the plats may look very much like what you see today. So it's very soil dependent. And one of the first tasks they have to do is go out and investigate the soils and design their plat based on what soils are there. See what fits and works with that, what's infeasible, what's feasible.
So in that case, if the soil is not compatible with rain gardens, what is the alternative? Are they then not required to manage that stormwater on site? I guess that's where I'm lost.
They still are, but so in the new manual, the major change from the manual, the 2005 manual, to the new manual, the 2012, is it's called minimum requirement number 5, and what it has in it is a prescriptive list of what's called on-site stormwater management BMPs. And they say start at the top item on the list and apply the first item that is feasible according to their criteria for the landscaping, for the roofs, and for the hard surfaces. So In the grass here, there's a requirement for certain soil quality, because they want the soil to absorb the water and to be healthy so people don't use fertilizers. That one's pretty easy to do. Then for the roofs, they have to do what's called full dispersion or a rain garden. Full dispersion is hard to do. It takes a lot of land. It's putting water out into a vegetated area of a certain size and at certain maximum slopes. So if you live down in the county on 5 acres, it's probably pretty easy to put your roof off into the vegetated area, and that vegetated area is probably big enough to absorb the water. But when you're in town, it's hard to get that land. So then the next item is a rain garden. So like we talked about a few times, I believe, knowing the soils around here, the workhorses for most plats will be rain gardens for the roofs and pervious pavements for the driveways. And the walkways, it applies to the walkways and patios too, the pervious pavements. So,
But if the soils don't support those ideas.
Yeah,
then-
I'm sorry. So yeah, continuing on. So if the soils are infeasible, they don't have to do, they go down that list, and the first two that are feasible if the soils are okay are rain garden for the roof and pervious pavements for the hard surfaces, the driveways and walkways. If those are infeasible, there's a few more items under that. And the infeasible criteria is generally based on soil or groundwater. There's a few other things like archaeology, or like a Gary oak tree. You wouldn't have to take a Gary oak tree down to do this. But once you get off that list, you don't have to do anything more than what they do today. So they'd be back just to a straight detention pond.
Okay.
So you just go through the list, go, is it infeasible, yes or no, and keep going until you find one that's feasible. If you get all the way to the bottom of this list, the plat will look pretty much like our current plats do. There'll be a pond and some kind of treatment. Maybe it's what's called a wet pond, or maybe it's got the canister filters for the treatment, or maybe it's got a bioretention swale, or maybe it has a bioretention, there's biofiltration swales and bioretention swales. Both of them provide treatment. The ponds are the big deal right now with the current development because they take a lot of land.
Should we move on to the next example?
No, I don't need that. We had some discussion at the last Planning Commission meeting on looking at maybe a standard lot size with a standard house footprint, and how an existing floor plan, whether that would, what size is basically left over from a standard lot to accommodate additional 2,000 square feet, which would trigger these new LID requirements. And this is a standard 7,200 square foot lot, and with our standard setbacks and a house footprint of about 2,100 square feet, you can tell that the size of this box is 2,000 square feet. There is basically no room for an additional new development of hard surfaces that would exceed this requirement in LID. Looking at a larger lot of about 11,500, which is about a quarter acre or so. Standard house size of 1,800 square feet. The 2,000 square foot additional hard surfaces that somebody could potentially develop on this lot may or may not trigger the stormwater requirements. It really depends on the configuration of this, but still it doesn't leave a lot of room here if this is all new impervious surface that would trigger the low impact development. There would have to be some accommodation of that somewhere else on this lot. Looking at it a little bit more graphically, thanks to Ray, we have a shop or a garage that's created here that has approximately 864 square feet, and a driveway that's impervious that goes back to this shop or garage. This total of hard surface on this lot size of 11,500 does exceed the 2,000 square feet and would have to accommodate the low impact development. However, in this configuration, you can tell that this shop or garage is really back towards the rear of that lot, which extends this driveway and creates more impervious surface. Under a different design concept, the same shop size, but shorter distance for the driveway creates a threshold that is under the 2,000 square feet, would not require the low-impact development. So we just thought we'd present this and give you a little bit idea that our standard 7,200 square foot lot that has a standard house size on it with a driveway of hard surfaces, 2,000 additional hard surface development on that lot is really impractical, basically impossible. So with that, that ends staff's presentation. We would certainly entertain any additional questions you may have. We did have this out for public review. We have not received any public comments on this. And also, as a reminder, if you would like to move a recommendation forward, that we are removing Section 39 of the proposed ordinance. And we do have it scheduled for City Council review next Tuesday evening, the 15th.
I have a question just on this last example here. So if I'm a homeowner and I'm coming to the city for a permit and I'm presenting you with the first design that exceeds the 2,000 square feet, are you going to caution me or share with me that there's an alternative option that's less than 2,000 square feet? So that, I mean, how does that work?
Yes, we do. And we do it, and actually, I was anticipating that question. We do that all the time right now. Maybe somebody really wants to build a particular kind of shed, but they're not particularly interested in a permit, and we say, okay, well, if you can make the square footage below that what requires a permit, then you don't need to do that. You know, they might have other sorts of challenges, and we help them find the way that is still code compliant,
Okay.
that's easiest for them. And this would be a perfect example.
Because that's a win-win, right? We're
Absolutely.
harming less of the surface.
Yep.
And, yeah.
We're meeting the standards.
Yeah.
The citizen isn't required to go through that additional process. Sometimes they say, no, this is what I want to build, and this is what I'm going to do. And then we say, okay, great, then here are the things that you're going to follow. So, but we give that kind of guidance every day.
Dennis, can you go back to the one previous to that? Okay, that's smaller than that, the next one. Okay, if you took that same house, now you indicated that's like a single-story house, but say that they're building a 2,000 square foot two-story house. The footprint's smaller. Now that's going to trigger the LID requirements, won't it? Because all those, you'll have more side, back, rear yard setback, side yard setback with a two-story structure. So what I'm getting at is if we have a 20-lot development and the developer comes in and says, I'm going to build 2,000 square foot, all two stories. Okay. Because there's so much ground left after the footprint is there, will that trigger the lid requirement?
If it's a new development, yes.
Okay.
But this example and these other ones are intended to address the commission's comments and concerns about
Okay.
how does this apply to the existing neighborhood.
Existing.
Right.
Right, and so
Okay.
our goal with this particular sketch was to say, if it is a 7,200 square foot lot with an existing home on it, while it's certainly not impossible, it's pretty darn difficult to get an additional 2,000 square feet of hard surface on something like this and then trigger those requirements.
Okay.
So whether it's, you know, a little extra patio area, or it's a sunroom or a mudroom addition, you're probably not going to hit that 2,000 square foot threshold. The other thing, which is while we certainly have a lot of 7,200 square foot lots, but they're by no means as common as they used to be, right? And so a large portion of our community has lots which are smaller than that, right? And the footprint of the house has not gotten terribly much smaller.
Yeah.
So there's even less land for the homeowner to contemplate some sort of change that would get above that 2,000 square foot. So again, the goal here was only to show the existing conditions and what you might expect.
Okay.
One of the things that caught my eye as I was glancing through here is the comment about increasing the height of buildings by 10 feet. Does that apply to single-family residential, or is that only for multifamily?
That would be multifamily and commercial, I think we had that stated.
Okay.
Yep.
Yeah, because it says that in one place, but it doesn't say it in the other place. I just wanted to make sure I understood that correctly. Thank you.
So you need a separate motion for the striking of,
I don't think it has to be a separate motion.
just included in the motion?
Yes.
And Mr. Chairman, I'm not sure that I remember if the hearing was opened or not. So if, did we get the hearing? We should still need, open it today.
Yes, we gotta open it.
Yes.
I have that.
Okay.
So at this time, I suspect that we should open the public hearing, the continuation. I'll open it and ask for a public comment. Seeing no one in the audience that wants to give public comment, I guess I will close the public hearing. Now, commissioners, questions, comments?
On the page 7, the first fold-out document you got, Dennis?
Of the matrix?
Yes. You talk about the first column, building locations, incentives to developers to provide parking within garages rather than surface parking lots.
Page, oh, 7 of the master page.
7.
Okay.
Yeah, it's on the
Okay.
trifold.
Again, Mr. Commissioner, where was that reference?
So they're not going to have any,
That's in a commercial application, Mr. Freeman,
That's commercial?
not in a single-family application.
Right, that's correct. Yeah, that is applicable to the commercial.
okay.
So in that particular case, let's just follow that across so that it's clear how the matrix works. There is no conflict or gap because our design guidelines provide some parking reductions if parking is provided in the structures. And so we don't need to take any steps to implement that particular suggestion.
Okay.
Absolutely. I entertain a motion.
I move that we recommend approval to the City Council of Ordinance Number 1784, incorporating low-impact development, best management practices, and principles into the Oak Harbor Municipal Code, with the exception of Section 39 in reference to creeks.
I'll second that.
We have a motion and a second. All in favor?
Aye.
All opposed? Motion passes.
Thank you, Commissioners.
Thank you very much.
One other little item of business is that the next regular business meeting will be on November 22nd, 2016, our regular monthly planning commission meeting. Any other things for the good of the order? If not, meeting is adjourned.